The shrill ring of the phone cut through the silence of the night, jolting Hannah out of her sleep. A body had been found. Blood spilled across the floor. A message scrawled in red. The kind of crime scene that made even the most seasoned officers uneasy. Hannah felt her pulse race as she dressed quickly, knowing that this wasn't just another case. This was something much darker. Her mind raced with questions. Was it a message? A warning? Or was someone trying to hide something more terrifying? The lights of the police car flickered in the distance, its siren echoing off the empty streets. Hannah had always feared that one day the darkness would find her, but now, standing at the heart of it, she couldn't turn back. The case was personal now. Too personal. What could be waiting for her inside that room? Cold air inside the apartment clung to Hannah's skin as she stepped out of the room. She had seen countless crime scenes in her years as a detective, but this one was different. There was something unnerving about the way the blood had been arranged, deliberate, almost as if the killer was trying to communicate. Michael, her ally, stood waiting outside. His expression mirrored her thoughts, grim and uncertain. He was usually the steady one, the voice of reason. But even he couldn't hide his concern tonight. Hannah had never felt so exposed. Every step she took felt like she was walking deeper into the killer's trap. "What are we missing?" she whispered to herself, the words hanging in the air. Something about this case felt personal, as if it were designed specifically for her. But who would want to send her such a message? Outside, the rain had picked up. It was the kind of rain that blurred everything, making the world feel small and isolated. Hannah and Michael were standing in the parking lot, discussing their next steps. "There's something off about this, Michael," Hannah muttered, her voice low. "I've never seen a scene like that before. So staged, so—" She trailed off, her thoughts racing. Michael frowned, staring at the ground. "You think it's a message?" he asked. Hannah nodded. It had to be. But why? Why her? Why her? Why now? The uncertainty gnawed at her, making her skin crawl. They had barely scratched the surface, but the feeling that someone was watching them lingered in the cold night air. Every instinct screamed at her to be careful, but it was already too late. The trap was set. The investigation was moving at a breakneck pace, but the more they uncovered, the more tangled everything seemed. Hannah felt like she was chasing shadows, every lead slipping away just as she was about to grasp it. She had always trusted her instincts, but tonight, those instincts were telling her something she didn't want to hear. This case was not going to be solved quickly, and it might just cost her everything. The fear in her chest tightened, but she pushed it down. She couldn't afford to show weakness, not now. Not with so much at stake. "We'll find the killer," Michael said, his voice steady, but even he couldn't hide the doubt in his eyes. Would they? The phone call came as they were reviewing the evidence. It was a tip, anonymous but clear. The voice on the other end was muffled, hiding behind a mask of distortion. "You're too close," the voice warned. "Back off, or the next body will be yours." Hannah's heart skipped a beat, and she glanced at Michael, who stood frozen, eyes wide. The caller hung up, leaving only static in their ear. The air around them seemed to freeze, the weight of the threat settling heavily in the room. Hannah knew it wasn't a warning, it was a promise. The morning fog clung to the streets as Hannah raced toward the new lead. The call from dispatch had been urgent, a possible sighting near the old train station. The sound of sirens cut through the still air, echoing off the walls like a warning. Michael followed close behind, his voice sharp. "You're pushing too hard," he said, but Hannah didn't slow down. The trail was fresh, and she couldn't afford hesitation. Her heart pounded as they reached the platform, the air heavy with the scent of oil and metal. A shadow moved in the distance, fast, deliberate. "There!" she yelled, sprinting forward. The figure slipped between the cars, vanishing into the mist. It wasn't fear that drove her now. It was anger, sharpened by the thought of being watched. For the first time, Hannah realized this chase wasn't about catching someone. It was about surviving someone else's game. By the time they stopped, the figure was gone. The silence that followed was heavier than the chase itself. Hannah leaned against the wall, catching her breath as the rain began to fall again. Michael stood beside her, his voice low. "You can't keep doing this," he said. "You'll burn out before we find them." She didn't answer, her eyes fixed on the puddles rippling at her feet. "They knew we were coming," she whispered. The thought sank deep, chilling her. For a moment the world felt still, the station empty except for echoes of their failure. Then a faint click sounded nearby, metal against stone. Hannah looked up sharply. "We're not alone," she murmured, her hand moving instinctively toward her weapon. A cold voice echoed from behind the crates. "You're getting close, detective." Hannah froze, the tone familiar yet distorted. She and Michael turned, scanning the shadows, but the source was nowhere to be seen. "Who are you?" she shouted. The answer came as a low laugh. "You already know." The sound faded into static, the voice gone. Michael checked the radio, frowning. "That wasn't from comms," he muttered. A chill crept up Hannah's spine. Whoever was behind this wasn't just watching. They were controlling the board. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that every move they made was being anticipated. "He's toying with us," she whispered, eyes narrowing. And in that instant she knew, this wasn't a random killer. This was personal. Later that night, Hannah sat across from an old mentor, Detective Harris, a retired officer known for his quiet wisdom and weary eyes. The small diner hummed softly, the smell of coffee filling the air. "You're chasing a ghost?" he said, his tone calm but firm. "Whoever did this wants you looking the wrong direction." Hannah stirred her drink, lost in thought. "Then where should I look?" she asked. Harris leaned closer, his voice a whisper. "Not at the crime, at the pattern." His words hit hard, sparking a realization she wasn't ready to face. The pattern wasn't random. It was deliberate, and somehow tied to her. "Be careful, Hannah," he warned. "Sometimes, the truth kills more than lies." Back at her apartment, Hannah spread the case files across the table. Every photo, every note, all pointing to one chilling truth. The killer wasn't hiding. He was performing. Every murder was part of a message only she could read. Michael entered quietly, his eyes searching hers. "You're thinking of going after him alone," he said. Hannah didn't deny it. "He's watching us, waiting. If we don't move first, someone else will die." Her voice trembled, but her resolve hardened. The decision was made. She grabbed her jacket, the city lights reflecting off the rain-soaked window behind her. "This ends tonight," she said, stepping into the darkness, unaware that the killer had already planned her next move. It was a quiet evening when the phone rang. Hannah was on her way home, the weight of the day sinking into her bones. The voice on the other end was calm, reassuring even, a tip on a possible new lead. It came from an unexpected source, Officer Carter. He had been distant, even cold, but now he seemed sincere. He promised a breakthrough, urging Hannah to meet him in a secluded area just outside the city. The promise of answers tugged at her, and for a brief moment, it felt like everything was falling into place. Michael was uneasy, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "We can't trust him, Hannah," he warned, but she dismissed his concerns, the need for closure too strong. As they approached the location, a sense of unease lingered. The silence felt too heavy, the shadows too deep. Something wasn't right. As Hannah and Michael walked further into the lot, the quiet hum of the city faded. The anticipation hung in the air, thick and charged. Carter appeared from the shadows, his face unreadable. "Glad you could make it," he said, his smile too tight. The exchange felt off, like a script rehearsed too many times. Hannah tried to ignore the growing knot in her stomach. "What's this about?" she asked, voice steady but not convincing. Carter glanced at Michael, then back to Hannah, his eyes flickering for just a moment. "You're close, Hannah," he said softly, "but not close enough." The words seemed to hang in the air like a warning. Hannah nodded, but the distrust was growing, gnawing at her. "So what do we do now?" she asked. Carter smiled again, but the shift in his eyes told a different story. "We wait." The conversation continued, but Hannah could feel the walls closing in. Carter's words were layered with meaning, each sentence carefully crafted to keep her on edge. "You're the one they trust," he said, voice quiet, almost affectionate. "They'll never see it coming." It took Hannah a moment to process. What was he saying? "Who are you talking about?" she asked, her voice growing more urgent. Carter smiled, but there was something dark in it now. "People like you always want to know too much," she replied cryptically. Michael stepped in, his face tense. "What's your game here, Carter?" But Carter just chuckled. "This is bigger than you, Michael," he said, his tone chilling. Hannah looked at him, heart racing. What had he just said? Was this all a game to him? She realized too late. This wasn't just about solving the crime. It was about control. The moment of betrayal was subtle but devastating. As Carter turned to leave, his hand brushed against Hannah's arm, lingering just a second too long. The touch was cold, calculating. Then, without warning, he pulled out a gun, pointing it directly at Michael. "This is where it ends," Carter said, his voice low and controlled. Hannah felt the blood drain from her face. The betrayal hit like a physical blow. "You're not going to get away with this," she spat, her voice shaking with disbelief. Carter didn't flinch. "I already have," he said, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. The world seemed to stop in that instant, the air thick with tension. Michael raised his hands slowly, his eyes wide. "You're a traitor," Hannah whispered, the weight of the truth crashing down on her. The aftermath was a silence that stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Hannah couldn't move, couldn't think, the betrayal too much to process. Carter had slipped away, leaving them broken in the cold parking lot. The air felt thick, as though every breath was a battle. Michael was bleeding, his face pale as he leaned against the car. "We need to stop him, Hannah," he whispered, the words barely audible. Hannah nodded slowly, but inside her heart was breaking. She'd trusted him. She'd trusted Carter. And now, she realized just how deeply she had been deceived. The pain was unbearable, but there was no time to grieve. Carter had played them both, and the game was far from over. Hannah took a deep breath, the resolve building inside her. The next move was hers. The city was silent, the quiet after the storm suffocating. Hannah sat alone in her apartment, staring at the file before her, the weight of the last few days pressing down on her. The faces of the victims, the lies, the betrayals, they all blurred into one truth. Everything she thought she knew had been shattered. She ran her fingers over the notes, the symbols, the connections. Every piece of evidence she had gathered now seemed meaningless, warped by the truth she wasn't ready to face. The realization was slow, creeping in, but undeniable. Carter wasn't the only one hiding in plain sight. She had missed something crucial, something right in front of her. "What am I missing?" she whispered, the question lingering in the empty room. The truth was close, but it felt so far away. Hannah closed her eyes, and the memories flooded back. The first meeting with Carter, calm, controlled, a man who seemed so sure of himself. The way he had manipulated the investigation led her to false truths. Her breath caught as she remembered the moment she had met him. "You're getting too close," he had warned. She hadn't understood then. Carter had been one step ahead, pulling the strings. But now, the pieces fell into place. He had been a distraction, a tool, in a much larger game. The realization twisted deep in her gut. The true enemy had never been Carter. It had always been the system, the corruption that had wormed its way into the very fabric of everything she trusted. The real betrayal wasn't personal. It was institutional. "Why didn't you tell me?" Hannah's voice was raw with emotion as she faced Michael. She could barely hold back the betrayal she now felt. He had known. Michael looked at the ground, his face a mixture of guilt and shame. "I didn't want you to see it. You weren't ready." His words were soft, but the weight of them hit harder than any accusation. "Ready for what?" Hannah demanded, her voice trembling. Michael looked up at her, his eyes dark with regret. "For the truth that everything we've done, everything we've believed in, has been a lie." Her mind reeled. She had trusted him. And now, everything was in question. The truth was so much darker than she could have imagined. In the dark room, Carter stood before Hannah, his expression unreadable. "You really thought I was the enemy, didn't you?" he said, his voice calm, almost soothing. "You've been chasing ghosts this whole time." Hannah's heart pounded as the truth hit her. Carter wasn't just a pawn. He had been the architect of everything, manipulating every step, every move. "You've been used, Hannah," Carter continued, his eyes cold with arrogance. "This was never about justice. It was about control. And now you're part of it." The words crushed her. Everything she had fought for, everything she believed in, was nothing but a game to him. "No," Hannah whispered, stepping back. "You don't get to twist this." But Carter only smiled. "Already have." The silence that followed was deafening. Hannah stood there, the weight of the truth settling in, heavier than any physical blow. The betrayal, the lies, the manipulation, all of it had been building to this moment. She felt her walls cracking, but the pieces of her resolve were falling into place. She wasn't broken. She was reborn. "So this was the truth all along," Hannah said softly, the words almost lost in the stillness. There was no going back. She had a choice now, revenge or revelation. She wasn't sure which path to take, but she knew one thing. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. And this time, she would be the one in control. The air was thick with anticipation, the quiet before the storm. Hannah moved swiftly, her footsteps echoing in the dark alley as she neared the abandoned warehouse. The faint hum of a distant generator buzzed through the cold, its sound intensifying the tension. She could feel her breath quicken, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Every part of her was on edge, every muscle coiled in preparation. Carter was inside. The confrontation was inevitable. Her mind raced through everything that led to this. The betrayal, the lies, the game he had played. She wasn't just fighting for answers anymore. She was fighting for her soul, her sanity. The door creaked open, its rusted hinges screaming in protest. Hannah stepped inside, the darkness swallowing her whole. The light from her flashlight swept across the room, and there he was, waiting. "Did you really think you could stop me?" Carter's voice broke the silence, calm, cold, and confident. Hannah stood still, glaring at him, her pulse pounding in her ears. "I didn't come here to stop you," she said, her voice steady, but the anger simmered beneath. "I came here to end this." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Carter smirked, his eyes glinting with a mix of amusement and disdain. "End it?" He laughed softly. "This has already ended, Hannah. You just don't see it yet." He stepped closer, his presence imposing. Hannah's hand hovered near her weapon, but she didn't pull it out. "Not yet. You've lost," he continued, his tone dripping with finality. "Everything you fought for. It was never real." The truth hit her like a slap, but she didn't flinch. "We'll see about that," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the back of the room, and Michael stumbled forward, blood staining his shirt. "No!" Hannah shouted, rushing to his side. He grinned weakly, his eyes filled with pain and regret. "I couldn't let you do this alone," he whispered, his voice strained. Hannah knelt beside him, her heart aching as she saw the depth of his injury. "This wasn't your fight," she muttered, tears threatening to break through. But Michael just shook his head, his breath shallow. "It's too late for that," he said with a faint smile. "You're not alone anymore." The realization hit her hard. This wasn't just about stopping Carter. It was about the price of truth, the cost of doing what was right. She had lost too much to turn back now. Carter stood across the room watching them with cold amusement. "You really think you've won?" he asked, his voice cutting through the tension. Hannah looked up at him, her heart pounding. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low, but her eyes burned with determination. "You're finished." Carter laughed, a deep, mocking sound that echoed in the empty warehouse. "I was never the real enemy," he said, his smile widening. "The system was always broken. I just showed you how easy it is to make it work for you." Hannah stepped forward, her fists clenched. "You can keep your twisted version of the truth. I'm done playing your game." She reached for her weapon, and as she drew it, the sound of the hammer clicking back filled the room. Carter didn't flinch. He simply stood there, waiting for her to act. The shot rang out, deafening in the silence. Carter crumpled to the floor, his expression frozen in disbelief. Hannah stood there, the weight of the moment crashing over her. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel relief. She only felt the emptiness left by the cost of everything she had lost. As Carter lay motionless, the quiet of the warehouse swallowed the chaos. The adrenaline faded, and Hannah collapsed to her knees beside Michael, her hands trembling as she pressed against his wound. The world felt like it had stopped, but the fight wasn't over. She had won, but at what cost? The air was still heavy with the weight of the truth, and as she looked up at the dimming lights, she knew that the consequences of their actions would follow her forever. The air was still, heavy with the weight of everything that had passed. The city hummed softly in the distance, but here, in the aftermath, there was only silence. Hannah stood in the same warehouse where it all ended, the space now cold and empty. The echoes of the past hours rang in her mind, but in this moment, everything felt distant, like a dream fading at dawn. She hadn't won, not really. Nothing could bring back what she had lost. The blood on her hands, the pieces of her soul that had shattered, they wouldn't heal. Yet there was a quiet clarity in her. The truth had been laid bare, and the world, for better or worse, would never be the same. The flicker of light from the window cast long shadows on the floor, and in the dimness, Hannah knew that she had to move forward. The world didn't stop, even when everything inside you does. As Hannah walked through the quiet streets, the memories lingered. She could still hear Michael's voice, the last words he spoke, and it was almost as if he were still there beside her. The guilt washed over her like a storm, fierce and relentless. She had let him down. She had let them all down. But somewhere in the quiet of the night, she also realized the weight of his sacrifice, and that, for all her mistakes, she had to keep moving. The world had changed, but so had she. The loss felt like a void inside her, but the truth, no matter how painful, had set her free. The question wasn't what she had lost, but what she could still do with what remained. Life would never be the same, but she had to find a way to live with it. She hadn't expected to see Michael again, not after everything. But as he stood before her, bandaged and worn, there was no anger, only understanding. "I told you I'd be there," he said quietly. His voice was raspy, but it held no bitterness. Hannah's heart clenched at the sight of him. Alive, Yet a part of her had already begun to accept that things would never go back to how they were. "You didn't have to," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But you did," Michael replied, his smile faint but genuine. "And you're going to keep fighting, right? Even after all this?" Hannah nodded slowly, her heart heavy but resolute. "I have to." The lessons Hannah had learned echoed in her mind long after she had left the room. Detective Harris' words resurfaced, a quiet reminder of all that had been lost and all that could still be saved. "Sometimes you have to make peace with what you can't change." His voice felt like it came from somewhere far away, yet it still carried weight, still anchored her in the reality of what had happened. The city was rebuilding, the world moving forward, and yet Hannah stood at the crossroads of everything she once knew. But now she could finally see the road ahead. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about what was next. It was about the life that still had a chance to unfold. The world felt different now. Hannah stood by the edge of the river, the water flowing quietly past her. It was peaceful, but there was still a tension in the air, like a storm waiting to break. She had made her choices, faced her fears, and now she was standing in the aftermath. The weight of everything she had lost, everything she had gained, was no longer as suffocating. There was a sense of acceptance now, the kind that came after everything had unraveled and been put back together. "So this is where we are," she whispered, a soft smile breaking through the exhaustion. Life had moved on, and so would she. The road ahead was unknown, but for the first time Hannah felt ready for whatever it held. The world felt still, as if time had paused, waiting for something that no one could name. The morning light broke through the remnants of night, soft and muted, casting long shadows across Hannah's face. She stood by the window, staring out at the city below, the same city that had seen her change in ways she could never have imagined. The fight had ended, but the consequences lingered. What had she lost? What remained? It was a question that had no simple answer. The people, the choices, the endless chasing. It was all part of her now. The world would keep moving forward, but she wasn't sure if she could. It was done, but somehow it felt like it had just begun. Was it worth it? Hannah walked away from the past, each step heavier than the last. The weight of everything she had gone through seemed to press against her, but it didn't stop her. She moved, slow but sure, toward the future, toward the unknown. She passed the familiar places, but they felt different now. The streetlights, the corners she used to turn without a second thought, they all held new meaning. Michael was healing, the city was rebuilding, and Hannah was learning to breathe again. There was no final moment of closure, no perfect ending. There was only this, moving forward, leaving behind the ghosts that haunted her. A letter, a voice on the recording, words that came long after they were needed. These were the things that lingered now. Hannah sat at her desk, the faint echo of Detective Harris' voice filling the room. "Sometimes the fight isn't to win," he had said. "It's to survive." The letter he left behind was no longer a burden, but a legacy, a reminder of everything she had learned, of all of the ways she had been shaped by the choices she made. The past was still alive in the words, but now they felt like a part of her, not a chain. And as she listened to his voice, she understood. This was her fight. She had made it through, and now it was time to live. The world had moved on. People walked through the streets, the city pulsing with the rhythm of daily life. New faces appeared, new stories began, and old ones faded into the background. Hannah stood at the edge of the busy street, watching as everything continued, unaware of the quiet storm she had just weathered. It was different now. Time had a different feel. The light had shifted, and so had she. The city wasn't the same, nor was she. The world had kept spinning, But there was an unspoken acknowledgement that things were never truly the same after a battle, a final breath, a single thought. Truth must never be owned. Hannah turned away from the window, her eyes catching a glimpse of the life she had made, the choices she had embraced. The world was out there and it was waiting for her. The past was part of her, but it no longer defined her. She had found her own path, her own peace. And as she stepped into the new day, she realized the journey had been worth it, if only for the clarity it brought.